Very good. What I wanted to do now is, I will ask a few leading questions a little bit that make a connection to these presentations, and then maybe we can get some first impressions from each of you with respect to what you have seen respectively from the others. So in this direction of shapes, geometry, and nature, I think an aspect that I found very interesting is this question of stories, and basically how stories and objects that we see in nature, or phenomena we observe, really has an influence on how we perceive the beauty. I think this is an aspect that goes a little bit also what we heard this morning with that questions that what, when, how, when we look at artistic objects. Also, this is something we have to keep in mind, we have to understand. So the story plays a role and it can tell us something about the beauty. Maybe we start with that question, actually. I mean, the question of the interactions of stories and how they shape our perception in both arts and in nature. So who wants to start?
I can, if you want. It's as you wish. I think that we humans and animals too, probably, we are really emotional-driven species. We are an emotional-driven species. Everything we perceive or see triggers some reaction in us, some emotions, because we experienced it some years ago, because we have seen it somewhere. It can be positive or negative. We can see an art sculpture or which can be very provocative, and it will transform us somehow. It will trigger an emotion. So this is very important. And stories. In fact, if you know the story, it will touch your emotions, but it doesn't have to be the same way for everybody, because everybody comes with its own baggage and with its own past. So an art object or also, let's say, a meteorite like I show, there are people perhaps who can't really resonate with it. You can't really do much with it, but others can, because perhaps they have a past, and so this story will be more interested for them. So I think that these lines is very important, and we should keep this in mind with when we also do science outreach. Everything we show to people or present to people or let people interact with something will trigger something from their past or something which they already experienced, and this is part of the game afterwards and can be positive or negative, but it's a good thing or advice for us to think this in advance, that also perhaps people can have negative feelings about some stuff, and if we anticipate it, it can help us out afterwards.
Well, maybe I pick up on the point of experience you were mentioning, sort of reviving things that we've already experienced. But I think for me, an important thing that art can do is also to let you partake in an experience that you didn't have yourself and might not even be able to have yourself. And we're talking about storytelling. I think something that there's not much of a question whether people think, oh, is this art or not, is if we think about religious art. And we look at, let's say, art that was produced in the context of telling the Passion of Christ. This is about telling a story, but it's also about imparting an experience which you don't really want people to have that same experience, right? You want to be able to somehow pass something on from that without doing so. And, maybe it's possible then for a monk through many years of prayer and solitude to get that experience without helping, without any kind of thing that helps them. But I think the reason why people produce this type of art is because that can actually pass on that kind of experience in a different channel, maybe in a faster way, maybe in a more powerful way, maybe in a way that talks to other people than other methods would do. And I think it can be a bit similar in science. Of course, if you study quantum mechanics for 15 years, at some point you may be very touched by it, you may feel like you experience it in a sense, but not everyone can do that, right? So we can try to find other ways to pass on some of that experience in the same way that it has been done, I think, very successfully in religious art, also in the context of scientific endeavors.
Well, I think the question is so broad, right? You can go in so many different directions. Storytelling is integral to the human experience. Two main things come to mind. The first one is about storytelling in the perception of the value of something. In relation, in my talk, for example, I used an image of a Petri dish that just had the word help written on it. And without any context, maybe you would look at this and say, okay, it's a Petri dish. Somebody went and wrote something on it. And then comes the element of storytelling. Who is this person? Why did they do that? And also the storytelling broadens the context and provides some other insights. And so this was an artist who was interested in the Serratia bacteria that produce red pigment that actually is found, it is this miracle religious statues that suddenly eyes start to bleed. So it's seen as a miracle is occurring, and people go and pray to them. And so actually it's this Serratia bacterium that started to grow on this sculpture. But then he was very affected by learning or knowing about this as an Italian person for whom religion is something very deeply important culturally. And so he spent a lot of time in the lab actually wanting to infect his own photographs and pictures with Serratia. And in the process, so you can say, well, he wrote the word on the Petri dish, and that's not doing science. So he's still an artist, like just writing something on a Petri dish. But then he wanted to transform them to his own artworks and had to devise, so what kind of films can be layered on top of my artwork? So how can I actually combine the two things together? And then like, oh, okay, well, in that case, the storytelling for me now is going more into the scientific realm. So as somebody is telling you this story already, you can also change your mind about your perception of this whole journey a couple of times over. And the second part that came to mind is also about storytelling in sciences. So I come more from biology background. And for a lot of people that study either pattern formation or, on the other side, symmetry breaking, they very often collaborate with physicists because a lot of these complex biological processes can very often be explained by some really fundamental physical processes. And sometimes this is a little bit heartbreaking for biologists because we really want there to be very complex network of interacting partners that are on a different systems level. So there is also this intuition that we are trained inside of a certain science, also with a certain storytelling associated in the field. And even having storytelling, not even between science and art, but also exchanging storytelling between two different fields of science, like physics, biophysics, biology. Already there, you can kind of break a lot of new ground. So those are all of my thoughts. Thank you. That was another talk. Sorry, it was too long. It was too long.
No, I definitely, I mean, I agree with you very much. In fact, actually, one of the things that when I was a young PhD student in chemistry back in those days, that really amazed me is when my PhD advisor came to me when we were writing our paper and he told me, okay, now we have to think about the story. I thought, like, okay, I mean, I'm doing science here, I'm not writing a book, right? But it's exactly this. I mean, communication within the sciences, even within one field, also always has this element of, how can I convey my message in a way that, you know, it's perceived with the background the reader has in the correct way? How can I get my intent across? And that leads smoothly to the second aspect I wanted to briefly get to before we open up to all of you. So have your ideas and thoughts ready. that would be, I mean, this interaction in exactly scientific visualization as well as art, that you really very much alluded to, the role of perception, the role of intent, and maybe these are indeed the common grounds that we should be looking for between scientific visualization and artistic value and beauty. So that was again a question to the three of you, and who would be willing to take a turn?
Could you rephrase the question into a question? Because for me, it is about perception and intention in storytelling and visualizations. Or what is, you have a direction? Ask us again.
Yeah, so I mean, the problem is I agree with you. So how do I make this into a controversial question?
Play devil's advocate.
Okay, so why do you think that these two aspects are so fundamentally important? Because I mean, in the end, one could just say, well, I mean, if I have a scientific visualization, it's about getting the science across. This is a neutral aspect. I mean, the whole point about science is to be rational. So how can there even be the second layer of communication? How can that even play a role? Isn't the whole point about science to remove emotional influence, right? So how would you answer to that devil's advocate's question?
Great, thank you. That's very clear. Well, I think, and this is why I started with the first intention of a need of reconnect, right? I mean, scientific communications also, it's a very broad field. So you can choose to communicate within peer groups, and that is one kind of scientific communication where you need certain language and terminology, where you're getting your point across. But at the same time, also in the current, cultural environment we're in, also there is a lot of pressure on universities, academia, and also other entities to communicate to the outside world. And then the question actually comes back to you and your intention. Are you interested and willing to partake in that process? Because it's not always mandatory. I don't know how was the organization of this exhibition, how did it happen? If somebody came to you in the middle of the night and said, your whole career will be taken away if you don't do this scientific communication thing, right? So this is not what happened. No.
No, Mark was very kind in asking. He didn't put much pressure.
I'm just making a hyperbolic statement, right? No, but I mean, right, there is a choice that is made about the importance of that expression and reconnection, because you also see value in expanding the horizon of this communication outside of the tight circle of your field, which is most of the time then only linked with your own career development. And I think a lot of scientists actually enter into the pursuit of science because they also feel a deep connection with nature. And I think the one thing to allude to when we're saying, is this something that happened with nature or are we observing it, is just to remember that us as human beings are also entirely part of nature, and we are, our perception of it is also a way of nature of perceiving its own self. So not to separate ourselves too much from that process. So those are my thoughts on that.
Well, if we do want to have a devil's advocate, I can sort of pick up on that line. I mean, we've been discussing things in a very positive nature, and I do agree that there are a lot of positive things about it. But I think it is also naive to think that that's all there is to it. I mean, of course, people have been using artistic expression, aesthetics and so on to actually push agendas. I think we're seeing things, for example, right now, discussion about quantum computers, where some scientists' public statement makes kind of billions of changes in stock market prices. But I think it's also a very old phenomenon. Like if you look at Galileo, one of the reasons why he became famous so quickly and why he managed to receive patronage successfully was because he was also trained as an artist. He could actually visualize some of the things he saw quite successfully, how to draw shadows properly, so he could convincingly argue that he was seeing hills on the moon and so on. So I don't think we should, I don't think anyone here is doing that, but there's sometimes a perception that there's this idea of having scientists and then somehow artists are like a service provider and they're helping them outreach communication. I don't think that's how scientists and artists should be meeting each other. I think it should actually be meeting very much on a kind of equal level, and with there being the ability to be critical of each other's work as well, and to kind of question You know, why do you want people to get excited about these things? Is that because of, you know, your own joy in it that you want to partake, or is that because, you know, you're hoping for some sort of results? I think that's something that we can ask very openly, and to kind of make it possible for artists and scientists to meet on equal level. Sometimes maybe it's a good idea to not just start just from the context, you know, neither in the sense of saying, oh, you know, here I'm the expert on quantum mechanics, let me tell you how it is, and then you'll be inspired, you know, here you go and take this and make something interesting with it. I think we should maybe first also try to see, okay, what else do we have in common? Where is there not a hierarchy between us? So, for example, I think both artists and scientists often try to create controlled environments to do what they're doing. You know, I had a project with a photographer at some point, and in the end, the result was nothing about the topological insulators we had initially talked about, but about how in a photographic studio and in a lab are both situations where you try to actually get rid of the outside world in order to create somehow something that is related ultimately to the outside world, or how, you know, there have been many artists who have been trying to develop new pigments, new ways of applying paint and so on to achieve certain new things that no one could do before, which is also similar to what we do in the lab. We try to build new lasers, new measuring devices that I see things before. So I think that, you know, this kind of whole storytelling, it is something we should also question critically between artists and scientists.
I can speak. Okay, no, the microphone works. Yeah. When it's difficult. It's difficult to talk to scientists. Yeah, I mean, somebody already said this in the morning. I don't remember who, but when we try to communicate to peers or to the public, people who are not really in the domain or not at all, I think that it's not at all a problem that we don't say everything we have to say. I think we really should put much more importance on how the people who listen to us will perceive it. Because if we have this whole bucket and we throw it on the people, they are there and they have no defense. I mean, they can't deal with it. They have not the background to deal with it. So everything we can do when we see them, for instance, for half an hour or 10 minutes or 2 hours, is to give them a story about what we do, but not exactly what we do, but what kind of work we do. And this emotion or this story they can take home. And this can be a very, very nice experience for them. And then we have some kind of impact. But if we have, and this is very much linked to what you said with the photographer, if we have a priori in mind, I really want to share these facts or these things I do in my research, and that's very important, then we can run into a wall. And I think that when we do these collaborations with artists, we should be very open to let other opinions come in and go a step back with our own intentions. But what people see from the outside will be there's a scientist and artists making an oeuvre, an art piece or something which resonates with me, and that's what will stay. And that's a positive thing which they will keep in mind.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Yeah, very, very interesting. Yeah, the question of intent and perception, definitely something that's relevant to both fields. Okay, I mean, I think that's the moment to start asking you if you have questions, ideas on these, exactly the interaction of science and art, visualization, perception, intent.
I have a question.
Very good. I think we actually have all the mics, so that's no, perfect.
Thank you. It's a very short question to all of you. you have some pictures. How much time did it take you to select them?
I have a collection of a lot of pictures like this, and actually I had a look at them Saturday evening when I was looking at the TV. So I was looking at the whole collection again, and then I did the slides in the train on Tuesday morning.
For me, I would say, I don't know, I also have a collection of images and thoughts that I somehow remember in the moment. So yeah, maybe about half an hour just for choosing the pictures to show you.
Well, I suppose there was not so many pictures I chose, it was more like diagrams I created, which I suppose took me something around an hour in terms of actually sitting there and making them. But for me, the more important process was actually, in advance thinking about, okay, what would I actually like to maybe bring across? And that's something that maybe I thought once about while I was on my bike, then I thought once about it while I was in the shower, and I couldn't, sum up the time it takes. But I think that's probably true for a lot of creative processes, that a lot of it happens kind of in other times, and the sort of condensed action of creation might be quite short compared to the overall process.
Yeah, but I have to say that again here, it's not so much time to choose the pictures, but it's much more time to think the story you want to tell. I mean, what do you want to say to this audience? And you have 5 minutes. I think it was 10 or 15. I don't remember, but that's difficult. So this took a little bit more time, as you say. It's not. It's in the shower or in the train.
Yeah, I mean, I also had some pictures in the presentation, but I mostly wanted to get to the question of at least on my end, how did I think about the kind of aspects to present in the exhibition? And I think it's very much like this. I mean, you try to think, okay, I mean, how much can I get across? Or what can I get across? What is the thing I want to get across? You brainstorm a little, and then comes the actual part where you interact with the great staff here from the pavilion. And then they tell you that you can maybe get half of it across, right? Because I'm guilty of exactly this fallacy of trying to put all the great science out there, but then you realize maybe that doesn't quite work, right? And in fact, this forceful reduction, I think, has been a very not so much fun, but a definitely very interesting process. And I think in the end, it has helped to make the whole thing better. So what I want to say is that actually sometimes having boundaries and having some external constraints to really force you to think about your intent twice, right? This often helps. I mean, there's this famous quote, I forgot by whom, but it's something like, I'm sorry I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote you a long one. Right, so it's really that. I mean, the selection of content, I believe, firmly is the part that takes the time. Kind of reducing it to the essence. Yeah.
Yes, I would actually like to pick up on that, because I do think there's one aspect which is a bit sort of orthogonal to the other themes we've been discussing, which is actually quality. And I think that is something that's a bit independent. Like, many of these things, they can be terrible. I mean, you can have the ugliest scientific art with people who thought, oh, I know how to use a 3D software. Same as religious art, you can have terrible religious paintings. And I think once I think it's actually a more interesting question to ask what is good art than to ask the question what is art, and what can we do to produce things that are of high quality. And a lot of it is really context. I think this exhibition is very beautifully done. Overall, I think the quality of exhibitions at the EPFL Pavilion is outstanding. And many of the things that you can achieve by having that quality just wouldn't be possible somewhere else. It's all about context. It's about the fonts you use on the text and so on. And things can't work otherwise. I mean, otherwise it's a bit like you put the Sistine Chapel in a shopping mall in Arizona, and you have like some Beethoven playing in the background while people are selling you trousers. It's all of these things that we've discussed. I think in addition, you have to say, okay, if we want to do them, we have to see how can we do them well.
So then, just to pick up on this tension between, this interaction between arts and science, what is good? What makes a good scientific visualization versus what makes an interesting artistic piece, so to speak? Like, are there similarities in the characteristica you would apply, or differences? I mean, and maybe actually this goes
I'll maybe give a quick because I think it's very difficult to generalize, because for me, I mean, quality does not actually mean aesthetics necessarily, right? I mean, I think, for example, I don't know, work of Joseph Beuys is not necessarily aesthetic, but it clearly has quality, right? So it's one of these things that's like, oh, you can tell when you're seeing it, but it's hard to define.
Can I broaden it, the topic from visualization to?
Sure.
Yeah. So there are two things. When you are a scientist and you want to communicate, it's important to know who is your audience. So it can be other scientists, and then you do a really nice drawing, which is technically nice, but you don't have the intention that this drawing will affect your audience emotionally and changes your audience. You just want to communicate something. And then I would personally say that it's for this audience, not an art piece. Now you can be outside of this bubble. You can have another public who looks at you like if the scientists would be in an aquarium and they have their world, and you look from far away to what happens, and you could take a picture of a scientist looking at a picture drawn by another scientist, or building up a new story, and this could then be perhaps art for people outside of the bubble. Could be, depends on what it is. It could be, but then perhaps it would be interesting to know what is the science behind. It could be something which led to weapons, like something very dangerous. And then if you look at the drawing, it can be art for some people, even if intentionally at the beginning it was just drawing. You can have drawing of an atomic bomb, for instance, or the plan. When you put it in a museum and people look at it and know what happened with this drawing afterwards, then it could turn into art. I mean, it depends on who looks at it and what's happening around. And the second thing I wanted to say is that it goes in the same direction. When I came to university here 2 days ago, I saw this big sphere, which was presented in the morning, and this artwork with the rods hanging, and I looked at it. I found it really nice when I saw it. Full stop. I found it really nice. Then, hearing what was told in the morning about it, it changed completely my impression of it. And I really want, when this is over, I really want to go there and have a look at it again and try it out and move it and make it sound. And so it depends what you give people with your artwork. So it's not the work itself; it's also the story. So.
Something you mentioned that started going in the direction of collaboration and kind of having input. You know, it also makes me think about scientific communication or choice of scientists to interact with this world, collaborative world, to think of it as more of an iterative process, right? Something to learn, something to expand, even if it's time or energy consuming. And there is one thing that came to mind. Sometimes there is a need of trust with another individual. Trust also that they're an expert in something, because for scientists sometimes it's hard to let go of the expertise if it falls in another domain. And you know, as you said, you worked with a team of curators, and there is like a guidance, and you trust the process to produce this quality product. And I think what we've tried a little bit to do in Figure 1A is also to put together scientists and artists really working together to show each other, okay, this is what I think, and maybe for you it's just a graph, but if we did work together on it, and then it takes on another dimension, and so I think there is a lot of value to also view that experience of development of something or the perception of an artwork as a continuous process. And I mean, your story was then a perfect exemplification of that. So you can yourself change your perception of one work on that basis. So
Yeah, I very much agree.
Trust other people who are good at what they do.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, and trusting is hard, definitely. There's a question from the audience.
Yes, I would like you. I would like to ask, because it's an interesting debate. I'm surrounded as a scientist myself by scientists, and a lot of art historians, friends of mine, complain about a kind of pression. Let's say it's a problematic attitude. How far you go for your kind of audience, no? Should you be didactic? What are your expectations? Are you doing this artwork for children, for adults? Because I find this a little bit patronizing. You should adapt your artwork for your audience as a scientist. Probably it's too complex for simple people, let's say. Let's do it in 15 minutes. But however, all right, then give me an example. If you present your artwork, what are you thinking about your viewers or visitors? And because then you have a kind of imaginary expectation, no? Do you put a long text, or in which language? Do you expect that somebody knows who was Leonardo da Vinci or whatever? Or do you explain that a little bit more? So what is your attitude in a concrete way?
I mentioned earlier kind of compassionate dialogue and compassionate description. And for me, part of compassionate communication means that you always assume you have an intelligent audience who is just missing a piece of information that you just happen to have. So it's not talking down to the audience, it's not dumbing things down for the dumb people, but it's more, where can I meet you, where the next piece of the knowledge, maybe I have it, or maybe I also need to collaborate with somebody to bring it to you. I think when you have your creative process also, if you just think about it as an artist, a lot of good art, whoever is to say it, again, what is good art? I think a lot of artists also share the experience is something that they've made for themselves. So I make this because I have an internal need to describe my state, and then everyone is okay with letting go of acceptance, right? And so because of the subjective nature of this, but if we talk about then the scientific element of it, it's also, there is this thought process or exchange that sometimes happens in the scientist's mind. I love this. I want people to see it, to witness it, to acknowledge it. How can I do that in one video, in one image? And I think that's then the work of compassion and also intelligence and lack of assumption. Then you can, and kids come to exhibitions and they also can have an experience without changing the subject of the artworks.
I also wanted to add something. I mean, when you are from an artist, scientist, or yeah. No, okay. Yeah.
No, I'm a literary scholar, but my father is a quite, let's say, famous artist,
yeah.
and of course, years ago, you could argue, in Switzerland, the name of Hodler is quite common, no? And it's basically also about canon, and do you know that, or should I explain to you? And it's very important, and so I would like to know how is your attitude
Yeah.
and your strategy? Yeah.
I think that when you do an artwork, or I imagine that, I don't know if I have already done artwork in my life, perhaps not, but I imagine that every time if you want to enter in contact with other people, with an audience, if you want to present something, you at the beginning there's something deep down in you what you want to say. There's a conviction or a message what you want to share, and this during the process of shaping this message, which could be in writing a book or drawing a painting or making a sculpture, this process of how you want to share this message will already be, I think, dependent on the audience you have deep down in you, or the people you want to touch. Because if you share this message very abstractly, or if this message is a very abstract message, then, I mean, it's not your role, or it must not be your role to do a children's activity out of it. You can very well decide that the message you want to share is via an abstract painting or a sculpture. Nobody will ever. And then, if there's a museum who decides that, okay, this is very interesting, and we want to go to, we want to have school classes here, then there's an art mediator who can then take this message and transform it into something which children can understand and can attach. It's perhaps not the message from the beginning, but it was processed by different people. But I don't think that there should be a pressure, or one should not. I think that you should not yourself put under pressure to do this. But it's imprinted in the process of the making, perhaps, that already your audience is there.
I mean,
what happens next, you don't know.
I would say, the aim is, and it's a very difficult aim, and you don't always reach it, and there's a lot of trial and error, but would be to actually create something that is of value for a range of people. You will always have a mixed audience. People will always have a bit of a different background, but I think in the same way that, I don't know, a painting by Vermeer, if you know nothing about his time, life, or methods of production, there's something striking about it, but the more you know, in a way, the more interesting it becomes. It doesn't trivialize it. Right? In the same way, when I try to give a scientific talk, I try to do it in a way that maybe people who haven't heard about the subject get introduced to it in a way, but maybe people who already know the subject might get a new, fresh perspective. Probably most of the time I fail in doing that, but at least that's the aim.
Don't even have to ask if there's more question. Who just
Sorry,
gets up?
yeah, no,
Perfect. No, go ahead, please.
But this is, as a comment to many of the things that have been said, I think there's also a danger, and especially, I mean, I feel that at least at the level of math, there's a danger of overweighing the quality of message versus the quality of the message. I mean, you talked earlier about Galileo, and there's for those who don't know it, there's a funny podcast called Archimedes Good, Galileo Bad, which is fun to listen to. But independently of whether or not the podcast is true, there is a danger of course, glorifying the science that is done by those who have the better storytelling abilities. There's a great quote by Paul Auster about writing, saying that good stories happen to those who know how to tell them. And I think that's also true of science. And of course, as a scientific community, you have to be wary of that. And you have to, I mean, in math, for instance, you have to make sure that you want math to get out there, but you don't want everybody to be out there getting math. But you have to make sure that, I mean, as a sort of a society, you also have to make sure that the important ideas, the important tractions in the science do get out there and are conveyed in proper ways, because there's political implications for all of this. Anyways, yeah.
Yeah, great. So, yeah, please go ahead.
No, I agree. That was all. Yes.
I think we have time for about, yes, one more question. Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure it's a question or I'll try something. Somebody this morning suggested the ability to recognize and to face failure, and this is what I want to do now. And we've seen some picture of cracks. And this morning there was also the Sierpinski gasket. And here is the failure. It's in my own work. I've been thinking about cracks. I'm a mathematician, geometer. I thought at some point that I had some kind of language to express them in the term of transformation, like we've been speaking about conformal, quasi-conformal transformation. And in mathematics, let's say, suppose you have a wall, at time t has no crack, later it will have crack. And sometimes it can be important because it could be an expensive painting and it has changed and it has crack, and maybe you will not restore it because it's part of it. But is it the same or it has changed or not? And in mathematics, we try to answer this question in the language of invariant. Okay, we have a transformation, something is invariant, something is not. And honestly, I've thought about these things, and the idea of cracks, the crack that you observe, I did not really interact with people from material science and physicists, and that's certainly my fault. Just looking at them and thinking geometrically, I have contributed to some tools that are called LQP cohomology, whatever, but I thought at some point that they could be helpful for that. And it's too complicated. So, for instance, a crack, you can think of them as fractal, but it's only part of the story. If they are fractal, what is the house of dimension? And so, there is a similarity between these cracks. That's a claim. You may disagree. And the Sierpinski gasket that we saw this morning, this kind of picture, and also the butterfly, the chatter butterfly. Okay, so this kind of object belong to a kind of spectrum of geometric object. Okay, maybe they are archetype or not. But in the case of cracks, I feel that we don't have mathematical language and theory to develop them. But nevertheless, they are there. We recognize them. We can speak about that. But I don't know if you have any comment, because it's sort of, it's there. So it's in nature. And in mathematics, where we want to see the pattern, we want to see here, again, I use the word invariant. Invariant for what kind of transformation? Failure, nothing. So it's not a question, but maybe somebody has an answer to this non-question. Thank you.
Yeah, perhaps I can say a word. It's also a comment, it's not an answer to your comment, which was not a question. So it's exactly what I think is at the root of science, and that was a little bit what I tried to explain when I was doing my presentation, that we have the ability to focus on curiosities and on things which are common. But if you have a closer look at it, it can start to get very complicated and lead to true hard science. And cracks are something like that. But you can look around, there are hundreds of millions of little phenomena like that, which you could try to understand, which we don't understand. We are used to some big scientific questions. Why are they big? Why is it important to know how to stack balls in 24 dimensions? You could ask these questions. So you could also ask the question, why it's important to know how a network of cracks will appear and what are, that you can exactly predict how it, when is it important? It could be important, both things could be important. But I think that the questions we ask as scientists are also a process of evolution of the bubble of scientists, because they became important, but you can go outside of this bubble and find quite quickly new questions which can be as hard as the other ones we try to solve for 2 centuries. And cracks can be a good example. You could ask questions, how exactly what's the exact phenomena, and describe it, which will make the leaves wobble at the boundary. It's clear, it's pretty clear how it works, but not explicit. So and it can everything can then be very interesting.
But by comparison, so bubbles, there is a neat theory. I mean, we have a differential equation for that. By the way, it's called the Plateau problem, what we saw, and it's well documented. And it's there in nature, and you see you have nice mathematics. You take, cracks.
Yeah.
Everything cracks down.
Yeah, at the end, everything will fall apart. So everything will crack.
Yeah. So just as an attempt to kind of cut off, not really cut off, but like close a little bit the discussion. I think what you just mentioned there has an interesting aspect in the sense that the way mathematicians address this question, like a crack, for example, and the way an engineer would address it is very different. As long as an engineer has, for example, an effective equation that governs the dynamics, it's fine. You immediately went into arguably the definitely very interesting question, like how stuff dimension, right? You really go into the deep mathematical questions. And I think and this relates to what Hugo has said, right? There is really also this question of what is the interesting story, right? Because like from a mathematical point of view, when I, for example, have a rather mathematical result in my research, then going to the engineers and trying to get them interested, that's a super difficult process. And sometimes they don't even realize what is the opportunity of such a result. And it's almost as if you, as a mathematician, have to do the engineering to convince them that there's engineering in, right? And so this relates a little bit to this question of what are the mathematical stories, so to speak, that make it to the applications. But also in the reverse directions, I often notice that engineers often don't realize where the mathematical problems are. So there's also many engineering stories that don't make it to maths. So maybe in this sense, communication and stepping a little bit outside of our own comfort zone and trying to see a little bit the other side, intent, perception, that is maybe also the takeaway from the session. And with that, I would like to close it. Thank you very much.